I think it's widely agreed that some of the best scenes from the Terminator films were those set in the future war. Watching the surviving humans engaging in guerrilla warfare across destroyed cities against Skynet's never-ending robot army was pretty badass. It's the kind of video game premise that really writes itself, and many developers have taken a stab at making games based on the franchise. The Terminator 2 arcade game was my first video game experience with the film series, and it hit the nail on the head for the most part, despite the fact that it devoured the majority of my pocket money back in the day, like some sort of greedy gold-digging girlfriend. I was unfortunate enough to also own the Sega Genesis version as well, something which was an abomination of a port, and only comes second to the chickenpox in the list of things that fucked up my childhood. I was, however, fortunate enough to own what was one of the best games from the 16-bit era, despite not even being a Terminator game primarily. What I'm talking about is Robocop vs. Terminator on the Genesis and Super Nintendo. It's side-scrolling action at its best and combines two of the 80s best film franchises into one badass experience with smooth visuals, great sound effects, and graphic violence. Getting your hands on an emulator and the ROM file for either version is extremely easy, and despite its artificial difficulty, the game still holds up pretty well. Around this time, there was also a series of first-person shooting games based on the Terminator films released exclusively for the PC. Now these were Terminator 2029, Terminator Rampage, Terminator Skynet, and Terminator Future Shock. Few people would be familiar with these games in the first place, and even fewer would know that they were all developed by Bethesda Softworks. The very same Bethesda Softworks who would later go on to ruin the Fallout and Elder Scrolls franchise. Okay, I'm kidding. Fallout and Elder Scrolls were never good to begin with. Alright, I'm kidding about that as well. Terminator 2029 was developed in 1992 and is the first game in the series. It's an action shooting game played from a first-person perspective, where you play as a TechCom soldier wearing some sort of super powerful combat armor salvaged from Skynet. You use the keyboard to navigate the environment tile to tile, and the mouse to select and fire weapons at enemies on the screen. Anyone who's played games like Dungeon Master will instantly be at home here. Before each mission, you're also given a briefing onto what your objectives are before being able to select your weapons and items from a loadout screen. As you progress, new and more powerful weapons become available. You're given coordinates for each objective, which makes things a little easier, but it's still a very tedious experience. Combat isn't that hard, but it is painfully simple with zero depth and not very engaging. You can't sidestep or dodge enemy fire, and as a result, fights just become something of a click fest, as you mash the left mouse button rapidly to kill enemies before they can kill you. Visually, it looks pretty good compared to other games of its era, and it was from a time where DOS games had a really cool looking art style, where men were all square-jawed Adonises and women were all blonde and full-chested. I mean, how many games these days can get away with showing a woman's nipples through her shirt? On the downside though, there is practically no sound or music whatsoever, which means it's really lacking something. A CD version was eventually released which added dialogue and a soundtrack, but copies of this are really rare. Overall though, this game isn't too bad, but unless you've got a real fetish for old DOS games, there's really not any reason to play it. Bethesda's next game in the series was Terminator Rampage, their first proper FPS game based off the franchise, and it is easily the worst game in the series. I'd even say it's one of the worst FPS games ever made. Yeah, that's right, worse than Operation Body Count. You play as a soldier entering a Cyberdyne facility to destroy the AI computer that has become self-aware. Along the way, you're supposed to collect pieces of an experimental rifle which are placed randomly throughout each level. The less said about this the better, but I'll just try to explain why this game is so fucking horrible. Firstly though, in its defense, it does look pretty good considering the year it came out, but it runs like absolute garbage, with a horrible choppy frame rate that gives me a goddamn migraine. Its main issue is that it's got downright horrid level design. The 30 odd levels in the game are gigantic mazes with a handful of ammo pickups and maybe one or two health and armor items per floor, which I guess wouldn't be an issue if it wasn't for the fact that they frequently throw lots of enemies at you. I was literally scrimping by on ammo and health the entire time, and it's not a matter of it being this way by choice, there is just not enough items in the levels for the amount of enemies present. It's bad design, son. Secondly, the weapons themselves feel really underpowered and the hit detection is atrocious, often passing through enemies entirely. Lastly, the sound and music is the stuff of nightmares. One thing worth praising is the intro and the game over screen, which you'll be seeing a lot of, but overall there's no reason to ever play this abomination, and even Mark Bustler himself would hate this game. God damn, this game is really bad. The third game in the series is Terminator Future Shock, released in 1995. You'd be forgiven at this point for assuming that it's going to be absolute rubbish, but guess what? It's actually pretty damn good. You once again play as a TechCom soldier fighting alongside characters like John Connor and Kyle Reese as you undertake various missions for the Resistance forces. Each mission has a brief animated cutscene which explains your objectives and overall goals. The first thing you'll probably notice is that it's infinitely more playable than Terminator Rampage in a lot of ways. For starters, it has a much smoother frame rate, one that doesn't induce vomiting, and it also uses a more modern control scheme, utilising mouse look and strafe buttons. This was something that was fairly original for the time before it was popularised by Quake, and means it's still easy to pick up and play. There's a few missions that put you in a jeep or a helicopter which aren't amazing to be honest, but are fun enough and do help to mix the gameplay up so things don't feel too repetitive. It feels much more like a Terminator game than the others, and it's got a lot more fan service as well, giving you more weapons from the films, and even letting you go inside the Technoir Club at one point. Another of the game's biggest strengths is the sheer size of the levels, which for their time is pretty damn impressive. They're populated with shitloads of machines, from hunter-killers to Terminators themselves, as well as a few new original additions. The engine does have its downsides though. The size of the levels means that the draw distance is pretty shallow, and you're going to be seeing a lot of pop-in. A lot of areas also seem to be copied and pasted throughout missions, and it can be hard to get your bearings, as there's often not many landmarks to guide you. This doesn't really ruin the game in any fundamental way, but it does mean that the visuals do show their age quite a bit. Another thing that kind of chaps my ass is that the shooting can be very buggy at times and also a bit tedious. Even with some of the game's tougher weapons, it can take 5 or so seconds of concentrated gunfire to put certain enemies down. The hitboxes also seem to be extremely small, especially with projectile weapons, and 1 or 2 pixels in the wrong direction, and that rocket you just fired isn't going to hit diddly squat, passing straight through enemies entirely. But even with these few issues, it's still a cut above the other two games, and it was further improved a mere year later when it was followed up with Skynet, a full-blown sequel released in 1996. Skynet improves and refines a lot of the gameplay, as well as allowing Future Shock to be run through the main menu, kind of rendering the 1995 version totally redundant. It also allows the visuals to be run in a whopping 640 by 480 resolution, which means it doesn't look as pixelated. The biggest difference is that the briefings between missions are now short live-action videos with what I guess are professional actors.
It heads west through the hills and then cuts south. Recon indicates the road is pretty well defended, but it will definitely bring you back.
You see, 1996 was around that time when CD-ROMs were really taking off in gaming, and it seemed like every game at the time tried to cram in some sort of cinematic to compensate for the new storage space that the discs allowed. These cinematics are like James Bond films. By that I mean that even when they're bad, they're still kind of good.
Agreed.
You've got to love the female soldier who walks around braless with nothing but a tank top and a paintball helmet for protection.
Major Catherine Parker. Good to have you aboard.
Or what about the whiny little punk who plays Kyle Reese?
I want to make a difference against Skynet.
I also don't know why they're wearing camouflage when it's been well established that the machines use infrared vision. But it is what it is, and overall it sure does beat watching 2D illustrations with crappy animation. In terms of overall gameplay, Skynet is a lot shorter than Future Shock, probably half the length, coming up to about 3 or 4 hours total. But the missions themselves are a lot more polished with less empty spaces. Future Shock had a lot of large open environments where you kind of headed in a certain direction until you found your objectives, whereas the missions in Skynet feel a lot more guided, which I think is a good thing. Picking the better game out of these two is kind of a no-brainer, and out of all the other Bethesda games, Skynet is easily the best. So in terms of Terminator games for the PC, that's pretty much all we ever got. There was a game later based off the third film, Terminator 3 War of the Machines, developed by a team called Clever's Games in 2003. At the moment though, I can't even get this to work, which really sucks because I had a lot to say about it. Lastly, there was a really cool looking mod for the Unreal 3 engine called Terminator FPS, which was developed by the same dude who created Primal Carnage. The project is pretty much dead as the developer's gone on to other things, but it's still available for download from moddb.com for anyone who's interested in checking it out. So if I had to pick any of these games to recommend, I'd probably end up suggesting Skynet above all else. Not only is it the one that feels most like a Terminator game, but it's also the best looking game out of the whole series and also comes with Future Shock thrown in for free. It's pretty hard to purchase a copy online these days, so your best bet is just to find a place and download it directly. I don't normally condone pirating, but fuck it, it's not like you're putting anyone out of business, and it's not like Bethesda need the money anyway.